Well, thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here. It's really an honor to be part of a Milton Friedman Day event because I could tell the same kinds of stories about how Milton Friedman affected my life and helped shape my thinking. But you know, Milton Friedman wasn't just a articulate defender of the moral case for freedom. He was a rigorous economist as well. And his contributions in the field of economics are important as a scientist and not just as a policy advocate. And it's a happy coincidence that the freedom that we find to be intrinsically worthwhile, to be morally virtuous, also happens to produce better outcomes for people. I'm not sure what I would do if the two were at odds, but luckily I don't have to make that decision, nor do you. The pursuit of freedom in education helps produce better outcomes, just like the pursuit of freedom in our economy and in our personal lives. So I have today an ambitious talk. So ambitious that I worry that I can't pull it off in the time allotted, but we'll see what we can do. This is like a unified field theorem of education reform. This is everything that I know about education reform condensed into a single chart. This is it. That's it. That's everything right there. So if you just copy that down, you will have all knowledge that I possess. So I tried to think of what are the different kinds of reforms that we try, and then what is kind of the logic of each, and then I want to review what the evidence is for each as well. And the one, I won't keep you in suspense, the one that works, I think best, the one that we should prefer most is, sorry, I'm blocking you a bit, is at the bottom, is a decentralized incentive reform, which we otherwise call freedom. And I want to go through and talk about why I think the others don't work as well, and what evidence we have about those, and what evidence we have about how freedom does work. So you can see the general logic here is that there are kind of two levers that we can pull to try to make schools do better. One is that we could try to give them the things they need to do their job, or we can alter their incentives to use the things that we already give them to do their job. Okay? So those are the resource reforms or incentive reforms. We can give them resources or we can give them incentives. And by the way, these are not mutually exclusive. We could do both. Within resources, well, there are kind of two big categories of resources we can give schools. We can give them money, or we can give them know-how. So maybe the problem is that schools just don't have the money they need to buy the things they need, to hire the people they need to do a good job. Or maybe the problem is that they have the people and the things, but they just don't have the knowledge. And if we just told them what those things were, they would do better. Those are our resource reforms, money or know-how. For incentive reforms, that also comes in two flavors, centralized and decentralized. And the centralized version of an incentive reform is what we think of as accountability reforms, where some central authority says this is a desirable outcome, this is a good outcome, and then offers rewards and or sanctions for individuals meeting or failing to meet those centrally determined goals. Okay? And that's an incentive reform, right? That's supposed to motivate people to meet those goals that we have centrally determined, or that someone has centrally determined. Decentralized reforms, there's no central authority that decides what the right outcome is. Individuals decide what the right outcomes are for themselves, and then they provide rewards and sanctions to people in the education system by choosing to devote the resources that they control to one organization or one individual versus another, right? And that's choice and competition. So that's everything. That's all of education reform right there in one slide. Thank you very much. It's been a great time. So let's go through the logic and evidence on each of these. So resource reform. This is not a new idea. We've actually been at resource reform for a long time. It's probably the dominant education reform out there, is to give schools more resources, in particular, to give them more money. So nationwide, you can see that we've more than doubled per pupil spending adjusted for inflation, so that we're now spending north of $12,000. These are the most recent numbers, are 2007-8 from the Digest of Education Statistics. For some reason, it takes the federal government a couple of years to collect data and let us know how much we're spending. So whatever number we know is actually always too low, because it goes up every year. So as of 2007-8, it was a little north of 12,000. We can safely guess that it's far north of 12,000 right now. That's a 131% increase. And don't say to yourself, oh, that's nationwide, that's not Georgia. In Georgia, we don't spend that much. You spend that much in Georgia too. And the increase in Georgia was even bigger. Now, the federal government doesn't actually report total expenditures for Georgia, but it does report current expenditures over time. The only distinction there is that excludes capital purchases like building schools. But they roughly track each other. So current expenditures increased, adjusted for inflation, more than 200% during the same time period in Georgia. So you are spending a lot more of your wealth than you used to produce outcomes in schools. And you might say, well, okay, it's not just money, but it's what money is spent on. So maybe the really important thing is for schools to use the money to hire teachers. Well, we've been hiring an army of teachers, a lot of teachers, so that basically the student-teacher ratio has gone from over 20 to about 15 in the last couple decades. Which is a 46% increase in the teaching workforce adjusted for student population, holding student population constant. That's over a 40% increase in the number of teachers we have out there. Now I know that you'll say, none of my kids have a class with 15 kids in them, so that can't be true. Remember, this is not average class size, this is the student-teacher ratio, and they can be and are different. But that, frankly, has to do with how schools deploy their teachers. So if schools decide that they're going to have teachers, but then have them serve as master teachers, where they teach other teachers rather than serve as classroom teachers, well, that will have larger class size, but still produce a lower student-teacher ratio. Or if a school decides that it wants to have more planning periods for their teachers, so that teachers have more ability to coordinate with each other, or more time to prepare their lessons or grade homework and exams. Then every increase in planning period is a reduction in allows a reduction in student-teacher ratio not to translate into lower class size, because the teachers aren't in the class; they're in planning periods for more of the day. So we've given schools a lot more money, and in particular, we've given schools a lot more money to hire a lot more teachers. And the result is no change in outcomes. And I'll show you a few different ways of looking at this, but no matter how you slice it, outcomes for students are more or less flat over the last 4 decades. And it's not that kids are much worse. Don't believe that either. Kids aren't dumber than they used to be or less capable than they used to be. They're just about the same. And if you think 1970 skills are, just fine for a 21st century economy, then great. Then we're doing just fine. Other than the wastefulness of spending a lot more money to get the same outcome, but probably skills need to keep up with a more complex economy and with a more challenging and competitive international environment. Our students have to be more skilled to compete. but they're not more skilled. They're unchanged. So this is reading scores on the NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's the U.S. Department of Education's long-term measure of student performance, and they have been doing this in reading, math, and more recently in science, history, and other fields. But the longest term measures are in reading and in math, and here the reading one started in 1971, where the average score was 285, and in 2008, which is the most recent long-term NAEP measure, it was, I believe, 286, so no change. And this is on a 500-point scale, so that's flat. And math scores, same deal. In 1973, when it was first administered, the average scale score was 304. Most recently, the average scale score was, I believe, 306. My eyesight isn't that good, but it's flat. Science scores, also flat. No change over time. In fact, a slight decline from 305 down to 296. And 20 points is thought of as a grade level. It's not quite right, but that's how people treat it. So about half a grade level decline in science performance. Okay, so spending more money didn't give us the outcomes that we wanted. And even spending more money on the things that everyone says we need, more teachers, that also didn't work. So maybe the problem is that we haven't given school the really critical resource, and the critical resource is to tell them the right way to do it. Maybe they're just doing it wrong. And if we told them the right way, then all that money and all those teachers would be put to much better effect, and we'd get the increase in learning that we're looking for. Beware of the temptation to be dictator. Remember that you may not know the right way as much as you are convinced that you do, and that there may not be a single right way. And actually much of the evidence, rigorous evidence, suggests that this is so, that there doesn't seem to be readily available right ways of teaching, that if only we were to do them, outcomes would be much better. So there have been 15 rigorous studies funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences on a variety of popular instructional strategies. Everything from reading first to even start to professional development to educational software. They've tried all of these things. None of them show large effects. Almost all of them show no effect at all. Okay? So this doesn't mean that none of these ideas are good ideas. They may well be good ideas, but when you try to get our giant education system to do these things, it doesn't help. Maybe these ideas would work better in a system that was more motivated to implement them well, to use them correctly, but currently we haven't been able to figure out the right strategy of teaching for all kids. It could be that it also could be the case that different kids are responsive to different kinds of instructional strategies, and therefore any single effort may help some but hurt others, which is why we net come up with no benefit. Of course, if we could figure out which kid could best needed, which instructional strategy, maybe this resource strategy would be more effective. But we're not that fine-grained and subtle in our policy levers, right? That we can just kind of give schools a big instructional strategy and say, do this, and hope that works. And so far that hasn't produced the results we want. There's an interesting study that the Gates Foundation did called Measuring Effective Teachers, where they have a very ambitious project with 3,000 classrooms with 360 cameras that they installed in the ceiling to record what's happening in these classrooms. Of course, they're doing it only on pre-announced days so that it simulates an administrator coming to observe a classroom, so it's not, the information may well be distorted by the fact that they're pre-announcing certain selected days when they're recording. But they're recording 3,000 classrooms multiple times a year, plus they're giving multiple tests to the students, the state test as well as a different test that they prefer, and they also have surveyed the students. And they're trying to see if they can figure out the right way to make test scores go up. What's the right instructional strategy to make test scores go up? And the grand result of this huge $45 million study, that's the cost for the study. The project as a whole, I believe, costs over $150 million. The net result is they don't have any idea what works. Nothing works, as far as they can tell. There's no single strategy that seems to be dominant so far. Now, it's possible that as they review these videotapes that they may uncover something still. But so far, they have produced no results at all about what the effective strategy is. Okay, so it appears that what works is highly dependent on context. Different things seem to work depending on who the teacher is, who the kids are, and what the circumstance is. And think about this. This is like saying, what is the right speaking style? Well, it depends who you are. Not everyone should give a speech in the same way. Or it depends on who your audience is. You don't give the same kind of speech to everyone, no matter who they are. Or maybe it's like food, right? I mean, what's the right way to cook? Well, I don't know. It depends on what your skill is as a chef. It depends on what food you have available, and it depends on what the tastes of your customers are. And so a lot of things in life don't lend themselves to single solutions. They lend themselves to highly varied solutions, and this, again, is part of the essence of freedom, is our recognition of our diversity with respect to our tastes and needs. So I just want to make a little digression here to point out the warning, to make a warning about the dangers of Common Core. So this is another Gates-backed initiative, also heavily promoted by the Obama administration and Secretary of Education Arne Duncan. And they want to come up with a set of national standards, and they have in the area of math and reading. I should emphasize this is not a voluntary exercise, although they portray it as such. States are under financial compulsion to do it. If they wish to receive Race to the Top money, they had to commit to the adoption of Common Core standards. And in addition, as states bump up against No Child Left Behind, impossible to meet goals, they are seeking waivers that the U.S. Department of Education has decided without statutory authorization to grant waivers if you agree to do the things that they like. And among those things is to have rigorous national standards, which could be Common Core. You don't have to prove to them that Common Core is rigorous, but you may choose something else as long as you prove to them that it is also good. So, completely voluntary. You could either do what we tell you, or you could prove that what you're doing is at least as good, and we get to judge. So, completely free. So, what's the problem with this top-down approach of saying let's come up with standards and let's have them be present everywhere, and they're rigorous standards and they're uniform standards, so if kids move from place to place, that'll be good, that'll be seamless. Well, there are lots of problems with this, and I'd be happy in question and answer to go into it in more depth. But the simple answer is twofold. One is that most independent evaluations of these specific standards have found them to be quite mediocre and significantly worse than the standards in many of our states as well. So I don't know, frankly, how to judge the quality of standards. I'm not very good at that. But according to the people who are engaged in those judgments, who are not on the payroll directly of the Gates Foundation, the assessment is that it's not producing rigorous standards. So that's one thing, is that these standards are actually not good standards. And by the way, once we get them in place, you're stuck with them, right? Now, these are the standards you're going to have for a long, long, long time, because it takes enormous political capital to change something like this. So once we have them, we're stuck with them. And 40-some states have adopted them, so we're kind of stuck with them for a while. The second problem is a more serious problem, I think, which is you don't want to build a national infrastructure for our education system. And the national infrastructure is that standards then drive assessment, and assessment drives instruction. So if you can control the standards, and if the standards are more than just a bunch of empty words, you're really controlling kind of the whole education system in an imprecise way, but you are having huge influence over everything that goes down all the way to what is being read in classrooms and how things are being taught. And the reason why you don't really want to build a national church of education is that you have to remember, as reformers, you're a minority religion. And even if you think that the current standards are good ones, over time you won't be in charge of this church. Someone else will, and the gospel being preached won't be yours. It'll be someone else's. And so reformers have to be wary of some quick national fix, because everyone fantasizes that they'll be the dictator in charge, but it won't be you. It's going to be someone else, and they're not going to be as nice as you. All of this comes down to the teacher union slogan in their advertising where they say, "We know what to do, just give us the resources to do it." I think the truth is we don't know what to do, or at least we don't know what to do for everyone. We have ideas about what to do for different kinds of kids in different kinds of circumstances, but there is no single solution to our instructional needs. So that's our resource solutions. What about now incentive solutions? If the problem isn't that we haven't given schools money or money for the right things or the right know-how, maybe the problem is that we need to figure out a way to give schools the motivation to use the resources well. The kind of most common incentive reform is an accountability reform. And accountability is a central authority deciding this is what's good, and then attaching rewards and sanctions to meeting or failing to meet those centrally determined goals. So there have been some studies to suggest that we get good outcomes when we impose accountability solutions. There have been improvements as a result of accountability regimes. And this has been true. No Child Left Behind actually produced some progress in recent years. And it actually just built upon state accountability testing that had already been in place in 37 states prior to No Child Left Behind. So this was something that was already underway, and it has produced some progress. But it's also important to keep in mind that in the early years of the Soviet Union, they also had very rapid economic growth. And why did they have very rapid economic growth? Well, because if you have slack resources, that is low levels of motivation, and you point a gun at people's heads and you say, work, you'll have an increase in productivity. People will go to work and they'll make things, right? And the GDP will grow very rapidly just by holding the gun to everyone's head and saying, work. And I don't want to say that accountability reforms are quite the same. It's not nearly as coercive, but the logic is the same, which is that we are trying to say to people in the education system, work, right? Go to work, do things to produce, right? And we hold some milder form of a gun to their head, right? Some sanction. Now, as it turns out, our sanctions are really weak. Our rewards are very weak. It's amazing to me that it produces any effect at all, but teachers are a eager sort, right? They're trying hard. They want to be responsive, and they believe all sorts of things about accountability systems that aren't true. They believe they could be fired. They believe that their school could be dissolved. And these things never happen, but they still believe them as real threats. Or at least for now they do. And this has produced an increase in their productivity and produced some gains. But just as the progress in the Soviet Union in economic growth petered out, so too will this, and for the same kinds of reasons. The problems are that eventually when you hold a gun to people's head, and you're not really willing to shoot them, they begin to figure out you're not going to shoot them, and they begin to slack off. Or at the very least, they begin to figure out how much slacking off can they do before you'll shoot them. And so similarly, teachers will figure out, and are beginning to figure out, what kinds of sanctions really will be imposed, what kinds of rewards really are available, and they'll begin to game that more successfully. And unless you can constantly up the ante, change the centrally determined goal, change the kinds of rewards and sanctions so that they can't quite figure out how to game it, the effectiveness of this will peter out. Because it's a constant cat and mouse game to provide rewards and sanctions that are centrally determined, because you never know quite where to draw the line for success. Because once people hit that line, then how do you produce the next success? Well, if you make the bar too far out, then they can't reach it, and then they get frustrated, and then no one gets rewarded. If you make the bar too low, then everyone reaches it, and you haven't really produced progress. It is just incredibly hard to figure out where to draw the line and where to redraw the line over and over again, which is an essential part of an accountability reform. It's also important to keep in mind that the same political system that is centrally determining what the goals are, it is the same system that unions have and teachers have a very strong interest in gaining political control over, right? So they can respond to these centrally determined incentives by improving their effort, but they can also respond by cheating, which has been a problem around here, and they can also respond by co-opting, right? They can gain control over the central authority and then change where the line is being drawn, or change what the sanctions are. And in fact, I think a lot of the merit pay proposals that I kind of early on was kind of enthusiastic about, the evidence actually has been pretty weak on the results of merit pay plans. A random assignment study done out of Vanderbilt on the effectiveness of merit pay showed no effect. It's really, really hard to design the compensation system just right to provide the centrally determined bar of success and provide the right reward and the right sanction. And the whole thing could be very easily co-opted. We've seen this in Denver. There's a merit pay program in Denver where they made, as part of meritorious conduct on the part of teachers, is getting an advanced degree, getting a master's degree. So they have redefined the old pay for credential system as pay for merit by just using the word merit instead of credential for the same thing, right? So if you can politically co-opt that merit pay system, you can render it toothless, which they can very easily do. So the gains seem to level off. We've actually seen this in Florida. Florida made some very rapid gains under Jeb Bush with his state A+ accountability system, but those reforms have petered out, and the gains have leveled off. They haven't slipped back, but they're not progressing anymore, right? This thing only works for a little while and runs out, and you need another drug to keep it going, but you have to get exactly the right one, and that's a little hard to centrally determine. So I instead favor a decentralized approach. And the decentralized approach, the virtue of it, in theory, and I can also review the evidence, but the virtue of it in theory is that no one has to figure out the right thing. No one has to figure out the right line to draw for success. No one has to figure out the right way of rewarding and sanctioning the individuals. No one has to be smart enough to engage in what is effectively central planning, right? Where you figure out what must be produced, how to produce it, how to reward it. Instead, what we have is the wisdom of the crowd, or the wisdom of the market. where individuals are making choices about what they think a good outcome is, and they're individually assigning rewards and sanctions. And our education system would then be the culmination of these individual decisions. And the individual decisions can't be co-opted, and they can't be rendered toothless, and they can be constantly adjusted because the individuals are constantly making decisions. So, as it turns out, this theory is consistent with the evidence that we have so far. So we can look at the effects of decentralized reforms, and decentralized reforms are choice reforms, market reforms, and they come in lots and lots of different flavors. And you have several of them here in Georgia, which is fantastic. You have charter schools, and you have tuition tax credit, which provides scholarships to students based on funding donated to organizations in exchange for a tax credit against an individual or an organization's tax liability. And you also have a special needs voucher program here, which provides allows money to follow a student from a traditional public school into a private school if that student has a disability. So there are a variety of kinds of choice systems out there, and you have several of them here. And it's probably a good idea to have several different kinds because there are design issues associated with each one, and that are complicated and can go wrong. So it's nice to not put all your eggs in one choice basket. So we can divide the results of evaluations of choice into a few different categories. So there are first participant effects. Participant effects are what does choice do for the students who get to choose? Okay, so for the students who go to a private school or a charter school, what is the result for them? Well, we have 10 random assignment experiments of vouchers out there. And a random assignment experiment is like a medical study where you have a lottery, and some people by chance get the pill, the treatment, and some people by chance get the placebo or the control. And the reason why it's so important to pay attention to random assignment research when it's available is that it's the gold standard of research design. And it's the gold standard because it allows us with high confidence to disentangle the effect of the treatment from the effect of unobserved characteristics of students. So let me translate that. Students are different in their backgrounds, and those backgrounds have enormous influence over their educational outcomes. We know this. We know that home life and community life and individual characteristics of students are incredibly influential in outcomes. We can't control all of those things. Public policy can't do a lot about those things, but we can change what happens in school or with our educational system. And so we want to isolate what does the school actually do as opposed to what these background characteristics do. And the only way to control for all the background characteristics is to use chance. If chance is the only thing that distinguishes whether someone gets the treatment or the control, then the only thing that could be different between them on average is whether they got the treatment of choice or not. And we have 10 of those kinds of experiments. 9 of the 10 show significant positive effects for at least some subgroup of students. More disadvantaged students seem to do better. And we have really quite large graduation rate increases from a lot of these studies, which is interesting. The test score effects from these random assignment experiments is not huge, kind of medium size. Some of this is because most of the studies are only a couple years and education is a cumulative thing. But also it seems that a lot of the benefit of choice is in non-cognitive outcomes. That is self-discipline, self-regulation, the ability to stick with a task, to work hard. And as it turns out, those things are actually more predictive of success in life. They're incredibly influential for success. So choice doesn't have a huge effect on knowledge, but it does have a very large effect on these self-regulation outcomes. Charters, we have really good random assignment experiments on charters as well. There are actually 4 different experiments in 3 different cities. And all of those are positive as well, again, for at least some subgroups of students. The results for charters are a little bit weaker, I should say, than for vouchers, and I can go into why that is. I think charters is kind of a more regulated form of choice, and so it produces a little bit less of the outcome that choice might provide. So a second category of choice outcomes is systemic effects. Systemic effects are what does choice do to the whole system of education, not just for the kids who get to choose, but the kids who don't get to choose, or as it's pejoratively put, those left behind. Right? So there's a little bit of anxiety out there that, well, maybe choice is good for the kids who get to go to an alternative school, but it hurts all the other kids. And it hurts the other kids by depriving their school of talent and money. Right? So it takes away those kids and it takes away their money, and those are good kids, and we want those good kids around, and if they leave, it hurts the other kids because they're deprived of that good kid, and they're deprived of the money that good kid generates for the school. There, of course, is an alternative theory. The alternative theory is that the potential loss of revenue and talent motivates schools to do better, right? Because they want to earn students and their revenue, and they want to keep those kids or attract new ones, and so they compete. And if we were talking about restaurants, you would find it to be quite silly to suggest that the way to make sure that we have really good restaurants is not to deprive restaurants that are doing poorly of the customers, because they need the resources that those customers generate to produce better food. How are they supposed to produce better food if they lose their customers? Well, you know, the way that works is they're motivated to produce better food because they want to earn customers, right? But maybe schools aren't like restaurants, and so we'd have to look at research on this question. And as it turns out, our public schools can rise to the occasion. They respond to competitive pressure. Now, they don't respond wonderfully, they don't respond enormously, but they do respond. And the overwhelming number, 18 of 19 rigorous studies on the subject, show a positive response. Achievement rises in schools when they face greater competitive pressure. We also have to look at civic outcomes, because our schooling system isn't just about producing economically useful skills. It also is designed to produce moral and engaged citizens. So what about the effects of a private system or a decentralized system on civic outcomes? Well, as it turns out, the vast majority of studies that have been done comparing students in different sectors in terms of their tolerance, their participation, the racial integration in the schools, shows very large advantages for non-traditional public schools, for charter schools or for private schools. And this is a little bit puzzling because, again, this was part of the whole logic for setting up a public school system, was that it at least would produce students who were aligned with the civic goals of our society, that they would learn to be engaged and citizens. The problem can be illustrated by talking about one study that I did on the Latino National Political Survey. This is a survey of adult Latinos, and it asked where they went to school every year that they were in school. So we know what kind of school they were in every year of their schooling. And it also asked a tolerance measure. And the way that social scientists measure tolerance is they ask people to name or to pick from a list their least liked group. So we show them a list of groups, or we ask them to volunteer a group, and they name their least liked group or pick their least liked group. And then we ask them, would they be willing to let members of that group engage in various political activities, like run for office, hold a rally in your town, have a book in your library, teach in a school. And so the more willing you are to let members of your least liked group engage in these political activities, the more tolerant you're said to be. So in the Latino National Political Survey, they picked the dominant choice for the least liked group was different than is you traditionally find. The number one least liked group, I'm happy to tell you, is the KKK. Everyone hates the KKK. This is made easier by the fact that there are virtually no members of the KKK. I think the membership's down to like a couple thousand people. So it's a matter of convention that we all hate the KKK. Former members of the KKK probably hate the KKK too. That was not the answer in the Latino National Political Survey. There the answer was gay activists. Okay, there's an intense dislike for gay activists. And the private school choice that most of the Hispanics in the study had was Catholic schooling. So what we're talking about here is what is the effect of Catholic schooling for Hispanics on the political tolerance of gay activists. And amazingly, the more that adult Latinos attended Catholic school, the more tolerant they were of the political activities of gay activists. Now, how could that be, right? I mean, I present this to people and they say, I just don't believe you. But I think it makes sense if you think about it a little bit more. And I think the reason why it makes sense is that we're not talking about, tolerance does not require agreement. Tolerance does not require an endorsement. Tolerance just requires a willingness to let people engage in certain political activities, the same political rights that you would demand for yourself. And so Catholic schools have a tradition of distinguishing between what they call sin and sinner, right? And so this may allow adult Latinos to make a distinction between the beliefs of gay activists that they strongly dislike and the political rights that they think they're entitled to as an individual. That they don't hate the sinner, they only hate the sin. It's also possible that a religious teaching helps really as a foundation for our understanding of liberty. That a belief that we're all made in the image of God might make us think that we are people worthy of dignity and freedom, right? So we are compelled to respect other people's freedom because we see in them the likeness of God. It's possible that it's simply that Catholic schools do a better job of teaching things. You know, just like teaching math and reading, they teach civics, and they just do a better job of that too. Public schools have problems in addressing highly controversial issues because of their public governance. So they're afraid to touch certain controversial topics for fear of offending a particular constituency that is part of the fragile coalition that governs the school. Private schools don't have that fear. They can choose to, they have an idea of what their doctrine is and they're comfortable with it and they're going to teach it. And they don't have to answer to anyone about that. So they teach it. So it's, any of these things is possible. The truth is the research only answers certain questions, right? So I can only measure that something is different, and unfortunately I can't tell you why it's different, but I just want to try to offer these as explanations for how it could be possible to find this unexpected finding. But it's not that unexpected because as it turns out, the same thing is found over and over and over again in other studies. Patrick Wolf, a colleague of mine, did a review of this entire literature, and the civic outcomes from private schools and charter schools is significantly better. So we have to be a little bit worried though about choice. There are dangers here that we have to keep in mind. So first we have to keep in mind that the research that I'm describing to you is all small-scale research. Okay, these are relatively short studies of relatively small segments of the entire education system, and it's quite possible that as programs grow to scale, that they will produce very different outcomes. And so everyone should be prepared for the possibility that you may not get what you got in a small pilot program when you do it at large. Frankly, I think this is part of the class size problem. So everyone points to the Tennessee STAR study as proof of the benefits of reduced class size. And the Tennessee STAR study was a random assignment experiment. It was the gold standard, very well done, and it found a significant benefit for students who were by lottery assigned to smaller classes, and that people point to that. The trouble was that it was of a modestly sized program in Tennessee that that appears to have problems when brought to scale. So similar evaluations that have been done in California when they did it statewide did not work out well. And you could think of the problem by analogy. Asking people if they would like smaller classes is a little bit like asking people if they would like a personal chef. Everyone says, yes, I want a personal chef. And in their mind, they're thinking Emerald. But of course, if everyone has to get a personal chef, if you do it on scale, then you get the fry guy, because we don't have enough emeralds to go around. So similarly, class size reduction forces us to go out and hire an army of teachers, which then makes us dip deeper into the labor pool to find teachers, and the marginal teacher we're hiring is less good. And so your child, you're thinking, the teacher that you like right now, but the teacher you may get as they go out and hire more could be a lot worse, right? And that's, in aggregate, I think that's what's happening with class size. Same danger could exist for choice, so we should be wary of that. We should also keep in mind that the largest benefits that we've observed from choice evaluations have been seen among disadvantaged groups. Disabled students, minority students, that's where we're seeing the biggest effects. White students tend not to produce much of an effect, okay? Or sometimes none. And now this is not completely surprising, because it's a little bit like studying the benefits of vitamin C in fighting scurvy. People who already have a good diet of vitamin C don't benefit from taking more vitamin C. Doesn't have any effect. But if you're vitamin C deprived, then getting a vitamin C intervention makes a big difference for you. So similarly, disadvantaged students may already be option deprived. They have fewer options right now. They live in larger cities on average, where it's harder to get to an alternative school district. To move is expensive. There are barriers in cost and in potentially in discrimination in moving to areas with desired schools. And so they're the most choice deprived right now, so they get the biggest bang out of being offered choice. Relatively advantaged students, well, we have choices. We have a system of school choice right now. It's called residential choice. You choose where to live to gain access to your desired school. And everyone's okay with this kind of choice, by the way. And money follows students when we do this, and we're okay with that. It somehow doesn't deprive the school. We don't command people not to sell their home. You must stay in your home because it helps your school be good. We don't do that. People can pick up and move, but it's a highly inefficient form of choice. So I think theoretically advantaged students should benefit from a broad expansion of choice as well, but so far we haven't seen it very much in small scale studies. So I would say that even if the evidence turns weaker, even if the evidence weren't as I've just described to you, it seems to me that I'm not sure that the burden of proof is really on advocates of school choice. I think the burden of proof is on opponents, because the idea of choice and competition is pervasive in our society. We're so accustomed to it in all aspects of our life. Why would we think that education would be different? The burden really ought to be on supporters of a kind of a bizarre system that is totally different from all other aspects of our life. It seems like the burden ought to be on those people to prove why we should do this. There may be historical reasons why we started that way, but it's very hard to justify why we would, if we were starting from scratch today, build the public school system that we have, right? And I think the burden really ought to be on those folks to explain why they would do that, if they could from scratch today build their system. And we also have lots and lots of evidence about the benefits of choice and competition from multiple aspects of our life. And so feeling the burden to prove it in this particular aspect in education is a little bit weird. It's a little bit like proving that gravity works in each room of your house. It seems like once we establish the principle that gravity works, Must we prove it in each room by dropping a bowling ball in each room of our house to see that the bowling ball in fact does reach the floor? What if something gets in the way, a bed or a sofa is in the way of the bowling ball and it doesn't reach the floor? We might conclude, gee, gravity doesn't work in this room. But that would just be an erroneous finding. And similarly, it's hard doing studies. And the scientific method is skewed towards finding null results, and sometimes we do find null results, and then people say, aha, see, gravity doesn't work, not in that room. But I think we ought to be suspicious of those kinds of claims. And I think the real debate here is not, should we have choice or not? As I said, we're already actually kind of comfortable with the general idea of choice in education, particularly in residential choice. Really, the debate is over what kind of regulations you want to have of this movement. And that's why different kinds of choice schemes will produce different regulatory schemes and could produce different outcomes. And there is devil in those details. And in some ways, I think that this debate has been won, I think, to a large degree. I mean, there are people out there, there are still dinosaurs walking the earth, who say, no, choice is bad, parents don't know. But politically, that's getting unacceptable. I mean, the fact that both political parties in their national platforms embrace parental choice, embrace the idea of competition, not just that parents ought to have an option if their school is bad, but embrace the competition, improve schools. That you hear this rhetoric from Secretary Duncan, from President Obama. That war is over. And it's over recently, so there's always the possibility of it being reignited and slipping back, but I think that war is over. And now the debate is over, okay, choice under what conditions, with what regulations. And of course my preference is for more. But that's another debate and another whole line of research that we could pursue. And if you invite me back after we do more of that research, I'd be happy to tell you all about it. So thanks very much for listening to me. I'm happy to take any questions.